a woman from the civilized world, a woman of maps and reason, who was dragged in chains into the heart of a brutal, lawless kingdom. It's about her breaking those chains, not just the ones of iron, but the ones she carried in her own heart. And it's about the secret tribe that gave her shelter, a people hidden from a world that had tried to erase them. The world, for Alara Vance, was a thing of order, of lines and measurements. As the lead apprentice to her father, the renowned cartographer Alistair Vance of Boston, she understood the world as a series of precise longitudes and latitudes, of elevations and contours that could be captured on paper, tamed by ink and reason. Her journey into the raw and tamed heart of the Utah Territory was the culmination of her life's work to complete her father's grand, final project, a definitive map of the last wild corners of the West. Her wagon was a mobile library of civilization, its crates filled with delicate chronometers, gleaming brass sextants, and reams of pristine, cream-colored vellum. This vast, sun-drenched landscape of red rock and endless sky was, to her, a magnificent and solved equation. She was not a pioneer seeking land or a prospector seeking gold. She was a scientist, a scholar, seeking to impose the elegant logic of her craft onto the chaotic, sublime beauty of the wilderness. The men she had hired to guide and protect her, a grizzled wagon master named Henderson and his quiet, competent hands, were a part of that equation and necessary, if brutish, variable in the formula of a successful expedition. The equation was solved, and her world shattered, in a narrow, sun-baked canyon the locals called the Devil's Jawbone. The attack was not a wild, whooping charge. It was a cold, brutally efficient piece of tactical geometry. A single rifle shot from the high canyon walls, and Henderson, who had been riding point, simply ceased to be, his body thrown from the saddle as if by an invisible, giant's hand. The world exploded into a symphony of terror, the roar of a dozen rifles, the splintering of wood, the terrified, human and animal screams, the acrid, choking smell of gunpowder. Alara was thrown to the floor of her wagon as the team of mules, their driver dead, went down in a tangled, screaming heap. She was a woman of reason, but her mind was now a blank slate of pure, primal terror. The men who swarmed her wagon were not common thugs. They moved with a disciplined, military precision, their faces hard, their eyes cold and empty of anything resembling pity. They were led by a man who moved with a predator's chilling grace, a man whose handsome, intelligent face was a jarring contradiction to the casual brutality of his actions. His name was Silas Kane, and he was the crowned king of this lawless territory. He was not just a bandit, he was a conqueror, a man who was carving out his own private empire in the wilderness. He entered her wagon, his pistol held with a steady, casual confidence. His cold, gray eyes swept over her instruments, her maps, her books, a look of amused, intellectual contempt on his face. A scholar, he said, his voice a low, cultured drawl that was more terrifying than any rough shout. How quaint. You've come to draw lines on a world that refuses to be tamed, little bird. His men were now moving through the wreckage of her small caravan, their work a swift, merciless, and final accounting. There were no other survivors. Kane's eyes then fell on her, huddled behind a crate of her father's books. He saw not just a terrified woman, but an asset. He saw her maps, her skills. You, he said, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips. You are coming with me. I have a project of my own, a kingdom to build. And every kingdom needs a good mapmaker. He was not just a thief, he was a collector. And he had just added her, along with her precious instruments, to his collection. She was dragged from her wagon, the last, shattered remnants of her civilized world. Her hands were bound. A rough, burlap sack was thrown over her head, plunging her into a world of suffocating darkness. The gilded cage of her Boston life, a place of intellectual order and social restriction, had been broken, only to be replaced by a new, and far more terrible, cage of iron and chains, and the absolute, terrifying will of Silas Kane. She was no longer a cartographer. She was a captive, a piece of property, a tool to be used in the building of a monster's dream. The world for Alara became a brutal, disorienting montage of fear and pain. The journey to Silas Kane's stronghold was a forced march through some of the most unforgiving terrain she had ever seen, a landscape that seemed designed by a cruel and indifferent god. She was chained at the ankle to the back of a pack mule, forced to stumble along on foot, her fine, Boston-made boots quickly shredded by the sharp, volcanic rock, her feet a raw, bloody agony. Cain's stronghold, which his men called the Vulture's Nest, was a place that lived up to its name. It was a hidden, fortified town, nestled in a deep, circular box canyon, accessible only by a single, narrow, and heavily guarded pass. It was a natural fortress, a place where a man could make his own laws, a place where the outside world, and its flimsy notions of justice, did not exist. The Vulture's Nest was a microcosm of Cain's soul, ruthlessly efficient, brutally pragmatic, and utterly devoid of compassion. It was a collection of crude adobe and stone buildings, a saloon, a blacksmith, a stable, all of it built to serve the single purpose of his growing outlaw army. Ilara was thrown into a small, windowless, and foul-smelling storeroom, her new home a 10-by-10-foot cage of dirt and darkness. For the first few days, she was left alone, a deliberate act of psychological torture designed to break her spirit, to strip her of her identity, to reduce her from a person to a thing. But Ilara Vance was not a thing to be easily broken. She was a scientist, and she began to study her new, terrible environment with a cold, detached, and analytical precision. She learned the rhythms of the camp from the sounds that filtered through her door, the changing of the guards, the drunken brawls in the saloon at night, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer at dawn. She learned the hierarchy of Cain's gang. There was Cain himself, the undisputed, intelligent, and utterly terrifying alpha. There was his second-in-command, a massive, brutish, and simple-minded man named Brutus, whose loyalty to Cain was absolute and whose cruelty was a legend. There was a nervous, weasel-like man named Slim, who seemed to be the camp's quartermaster. And there were a dozen other, hard-faced men, all of them predators, all of them dangerous. After 3 days, Cain came for her. He dragged her from her cell and took her to his own personal quarters, a surprisingly large and well-appointed building that was a strange, civilized island in a sea of brutal squalor. His rooms were filled with books, fine furniture, and, on a large, central table, a massive, half-finished map of the entire territory. "This," he said, his voice a low, possessive purr, as he gestured to the map, "is my life's work, my empire, but it is incomplete. There is a place, a legend, that is not on any map. A valley, fed by a hidden, year-round river. A place of green grass and sweet water, a veritable Eden in this god-forsaken desert. The old ones, the tribes that used to live here, they called it the Valley of the Whispering River. I want it. It will be the capital of my new world. And you are going to find it for me." He unrolled her own, beautifully crafted, and meticulously detailed maps. He saw the quality of her work, the precision of her lines, the scientific accuracy of her calculations. He was not just a brute, he was a connoisseur of skill. "You will work with me," he commanded. "You will use your science, your reason, to decipher the old legends, to triangulate the possible locations. You will be my royal cartographer. And if you refuse or if you fail, Brutus is a man of very few, and very simple, appetites. And he has taken a particular liking to you." The threat was clear, and it was absolute. She was a prisoner, but she was a prisoner with a purpose. Her skills, the very things that had been the pride of her civilized, orderly life, were now the tools of her survival in this new, savage one. She was being forced to use the logic of her science to help a madman find his promised land. And so, her new life began. A life of intellectual servitude, of a quiet, desperate, and very dangerous battle of wits with her captor. She would work at his map table, surrounded by armed guards, her mind a cold, clear, and logical instrument, all the while her soul was a raging, screaming furnace of hatred and a desperate, burning desire for a single, seemingly impossible thing, freedom. For weeks, Ilara played her part to perfection. She was the cowed, obedient, and very useful prisoner. She worked diligently at Cain's great map, her head bent in a posture of studious concentration, her movements slow and deliberate. She translated the cryptic, allegorical language of the old prospectors' journals and the captured tribal stories into the cold, hard geometry of her own craft. She created charts, she calculated probabilities, she slowly, and with a convincing, scientific logic, began to narrow down the possible locations of the legendary Hidden River Valley. But while her hands were drawing lines on a map, her mind was drawing a map of a different kind. A map of the vulture's nest. A map of its routines, its defenses, its weaknesses. A map of her escape. She was a creature of observation. She learned that the guards changed at dawn and at dusk. She learned that the weakest point in the camp's perimeter was the northern cliff face, a place they believed was impassable. She learned that the nervous, weasel-like quartermaster, Slim, was a compulsive gambler who was deeply in debt to several of the other outlaws. And she learned that Brutus, her personal, hulking shadow, the man Cain had assigned to be her constant guard, had one great and potentially fatal weakness, a profound and very superstitious fear of the desert's venomous creatures. She began to sow her own quiet and very patient seeds of chaos. She used her knowledge of chemistry, a subject she had studied with her father, to create a subtle but effective irritant from a common desert plant. A fine, invisible powder that, when introduced into the outlaws' shared tobacco pouch, caused a week-long, maddeningly itchy rash that frayed their already thin tempers and made them careless. She began her true work on Slim. She would engage him in quiet, seemingly innocent conversations, her voice a soft, sympathetic balm to his nervous, twitchy energy. She would let him win small, meaningless bets from her, a piece of her meager food ration, a promise to put in a good word for him with Cain. She was feeding his addiction, his ego, and his desperate hope for a change in his fortunes. Her plan for her escape was a desperate, multi-layered, and incredibly dangerous gamble. It would require perfect timing, a great deal of luck, and the successful manipulation of the three key weaknesses she had identified: Slim's greed, Brutus's fear, and the camp's own arrogant belief in its own invincibility. The moment came on a moonless, starless night, a night of deep, impenetrable blackness. It was the night of the weekly, high-stakes poker game in the saloon, a night when most of the camp would be drunk, distracted, and inattentive. She had made her move on Slim that afternoon. She had discovered a rare, and very valuable, geological sample, a piece of quartz with a thin, but undeniable, vein of pure, raw gold running through it. It was a piece she had secretly, and very carefully, manufactured herself, using a small nugget of gold she had sewn into the hem of her own dress for emergencies, and a piece of common rock. She had let Slim see it, her eyes wide with a feigned, innocent excitement. She had told him of a small, hidden cave at the base of the northern cliff, a place where she had found this sample, a place that was, she was sure, the source of a new, secret gold strike. The bait was taken. Slim's eyes had lit up with a feverish, desperate greed. That night, as the poker game was in full swing, Outlaw made her move. She feigned a sudden, violent illness, a convincing performance of a woman in the grips of a terrible fever. Brutus, her guard, was a man of brute strength, but he was unnerved by the mysteries of sickness. He allowed her a small measure of privacy in her small, dark cell. It was all the time she needed. She had, over the course of a week, using a small, sharpened piece of scrap metal, painstakingly and almost silently, loosened the adobe brick around the small, barred window of her cell. It was a desperate, bloody work that had left her own hands a raw, bleeding mess. She waited. She heard the signal she had been waiting for, a heated, drunken argument erupting from the saloon, a fight that she knew Slim, in his greed, had deliberately started to create a diversion. In that moment of chaos, she made her move. She pushed the loosened bricks from the wall, creating a small, narrow opening. She squeezed through, the rough adobe scraping her skin, and was out, a free, but very much hunted, woman in the darkness of the vulture's nest. She did not run. She moved with a silent, desperate purpose to the back of Brutus's own private quarters. She took out the small, canvas sack she had prepared. Inside was a collection of the desert's most venomous inhabitants, a half-dozen scorpions and a particularly large, and very angry, tarantula, all of which she had painstakingly, and very dangerously, collected over the past week. She released them through a crack in the man's window. A moment later, a high, thin, and utterly terrified scream A sound of pure, primal horror ripped through the night. Brutus, the invincible giant, had just met the one enemy he could not fight. The camp was now in a state of absolute chaos. A brawl in the saloon, a man screaming about spiders in his bed. It was the perfect storm of her own, meticulous, and very personal design. She ran for the northern cliff face, for the small, hidden game trail she had seen from her cell. She ran with the desperate, lung-burning speed of a woman running for her very life. She had made it 100 yards when she heard the roar. It was Silas Kane's voice, a sound of pure, unadulterated, and homicidal fury. He knew. He had not been fooled. A rifle shot cracked from the darkness behind her, the bullet whining past her ear, so close she could feel its heat. She did not stop. She scrambled up the first, steep part of the cliff trail, her hands and her raw, bleeding feet scrabbling for purchase. She had a 5-minute head start. In this land, in this night, a lifetime. Her desperate gamble had paid off. She was free. But she was also wounded, alone, and being hunted in a wilderness that was as dangerous as the man who was now, with a cold, murderous certainty, on her trail. The wilderness that Ilara fled into was a thing of profound, and profoundly terrifying, indifference. It was a moonless, labyrinthine world of jagged rocks, thorny, grasping catclaw, and deep, deceptive shadows. Her desperate, frantic flight was fueled by pure, raw adrenaline, her only guide the faint, almost invisible game trail that snaked its way up the sheer, dark face of the canyon wall. The sounds of the pursuit were a constant, terrifying presence behind her, the enraged shouts of Silas Kane, the baying of his men, the occasional, probing crack of a rifle. The bullets whining off the rocks around her, sending showers of sparks and stone fragments into the darkness. She climbed until her lungs burned and her muscles screamed in protest, until the last, dying sounds of the Vuri's nest were a faint, fading echo behind her. She did not stop until she had reached the top of the canyon, the high, windswept mesa that was the roof of this desolate, brutal world. She collapsed behind a rocky outcrop, her body a trembling, aching mass of cuts and bruises, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She had done it. She had escaped. But her freedom was a fragile, terrifying, and very lonely thing. She was a single, unarmed woman, 100 miles from the nearest semblance of civilization, with a pack of wolves on her trail. The first, pale, gray light of dawn revealed the stark, brutal beauty of her new prison. The mesa was a vast, empty, and waterless expanse of rock and scrub, shimmering in the heat of the rising sun. She was completely exposed. She knew she had to keep moving. Kane was a relentless and very skilled tracker. He would be on her trail as soon as the sun was fully up. She looked at her own tattered clothes, her bloody, useless boots. And she looked at her hands, which were awry and bleeding from the climb. She was a scientist, a cartographer, a woman of the mind. And her mind was now her only, and most formidable, weapon. She began to think not like a fugitive, but like a strategist. She could not outrun them, but perhaps she could outthink them. She began to walk, her pace now a slow, deliberate, and pain-filled shuffle. And as she walked, she began to use her knowledge, her skills, to cover her trail. She walked on the hard, flat rock where she would leave no prints. She used a broken branch to brush away her tracks in the softer, sandy patches. She was leaving a ghost of a trail, a whisper of a trail that would, with any luck, frustrate and delay her pursuers. But the land itself was her greatest enemy. Thirst, a dry, rasping fire in her throat, became her constant, tormenting companion. The sun was a merciless, white-hot hammer. By midday, she was staggering, her mind a dizzy, feverish haze. She was at the brink of her endurance, the last, flickering embers of her hope beginning to die, when she saw it. A thin, almost invisible line of a deeper, more vibrant green, in a deep, winding canyon that split the mesa. Cottonwoods. Willows. It was a sign. A promise. Water. The sight of it gave her a final, impossible burst of strength. She stumbled, crawled, and half fell her way down the steep, treacherous slope of the canyon, her body a single, overriding instrument of her will to survive. She reached the bottom of the canyon and found it. The hidden river. It was not a mighty torrent, but a slow, wide, and blessedly clear stream, its water cool and sweet, filtering up from some deep, underground spring. It was an artery of life in a land of death. She collapsed at the water's edge, plunging her face into the cool, clean water, drinking in great, desperate gulps. It was a baptism, a rebirth. The relief was so profound that it was overwhelming. The last of her strength drained away. Her body, having gotten her to her goal, simply shut down. She rolled onto her back, the wet sand a cool balm on her skin, her mind a peaceful, welcoming darkness. She was alive. She had made it. It was then that she saw him. He was standing on the opposite bank of the river, a silent, inscrutable figure, half hidden in the shadows of the cottonwood trees. He was not one of Cain's men. He was tall and lean, dressed in the simple, practical buckskin of a native warrior, his long, black hair held back by a simple leather thong. He held a longbow in one hand, and a brace of rabbits in the other. He was an Indian. He stood perfectly still, watching her, his face a mask of proud, angular planes, his expression completely unreadable. Alara's last, desperate hope turned to a new, cold, and very final despair. She had escaped the civilized monster only to be found by the savage. This was it. The final, cruel joke in a long line of them. She had no strength left to run, no will left to fight. She simply lay there, her gaze locked with the silent, watchful figure across the river, and waited for the end. The river of ghosts had delivered her not to salvation, but to a new, and perhaps even more terrifying, executioner. The warrior on the far side of the river did not move for a long, heart-stopping minute. He was a creature of the landscape, his stillness a perfect, unnerving match for the ancient rocks and silent trees that surrounded him. He watched Alara, his dark, intelligent eyes taking in every detail of her pathetic, desperate state. He was a hunter, and he was assessing a strange new, and very unexpected creature that had just washed up on the shore of his private, hidden world. Alara lay frozen, her mind a blank slate of exhaustion and a new, more fatalistic kind of fear. She had fought so hard, had gambled everything, only to end up here, at the mercy of a man who was the living embodiment of the wilderness she had so terribly underestimated. Then, he began to move. He did not raise his bow. He did not let out a war cry. He simply, and with a quiet, deliberate grace, laid the rabbits he was carrying on the ground and began to wade across the river. The water, which was waist deep in the middle, seemed to part for him, his movements creating a minimum of sound, a minimum of disturbance. He stopped about 10 feet from her, the cool, clear water swirling around his buckskin-clad legs. He looked at her torn, filthy clothes, at her bloody, shredded feet, at the fierce, and yielding, and utterly terrified look in her eyes. He said nothing. He simply, and slowly knelt, so that he was at her eye level. He then raised a hand, palm open, in a gesture that was as old and as universal as the sun and the sky. A gesture of peace. It was a small thing, but it was a thing that broke through the thick, cold armor of Alara's fear. She saw in his eyes not the cruelty of a savage, but a quiet, deep, and very weary intelligence. She saw a man, not a monster. He finally spoke, his voice a low, quiet rumble that was a part of the river's own soft murmur. "You are far from your own kind, little bird," he said, his English heavily accented, but clear and precise. "You have flown into a hard country." She could only nod, her throat still raw from thirst and fear. He seemed to understand. He unslung a water skin from his shoulder and tossed it to her. It landed softly in the sand beside her. She drank, her eyes never leaving his face. "The men who hunt you," he said, his voice a flat, emotionless statement of fact. "The ones from the vulture's nest. I have seen their trail. They are a poison on the land." Her mind reeled. He knew. He knew who she was, and who was hunting her. "My name is Kale," he said, as if deciding that she was worthy of this piece of himself. "And this is the home of the Anishazi, the people of the hidden river. And you have brought the world of the wolf to our sacred, hidden door." His words were not a threat. They were a simple, and very grim, statement of a new, and very dangerous, reality. Her escape had just become a much larger, and much more complicated, problem. He helped her to her feet, his grip on her good arm strong and steady. "You cannot stay here," he said. "They will find your trail. They will follow it to this river. You must come with me." He led her across the river and into the dense, green sanctuary of the cottonwood trees. And on the other side, hidden from the world by a sheer, unclimbable canyon wall, was a place that did not exist on any map, a place that was a living, breathing legend. It was a village. A small, beautiful, and utterly secret village, nestled in the green, fertile valley of the hidden river. There were a dozen or so wickiups, the traditional, dome-shaped dwellings of the Apache, their smoke holes sending thin, lazy plumes of smoke into the clear, blue sky. There were small, well-tended fields of corn and squash. And there were people. They were not a single tribe. They were a collection of ghosts, of survivors, from a dozen different, broken peoples. Laura saw the faces of the Apache, of the Ute, of the Navajo. She even saw a handful of white and Mexican faces, men and women who were clearly outcasts, who had, for their own secret reasons, abandoned their own world and had found a new, and very different, one here. They were a secret tribe, a new tribe, forged from the ashes of the old world, a community of survivors who had come to this hidden, sacred place to escape the violence and the greed of the world that was slowly, inexorably, swallowing the frontier. They gathered as Kale led her into the village, their faces a mixture of suspicion, of pity, and of a deep, profound, and very understandable fear. She was an outsider. She was a harbinger of the very world they had tried so desperately to escape. She was brought before their leader, an ancient, wizened woman whose face was a beautiful, intricate map of 100 years of pain and wisdom. Her name was Orenda, and her eyes, as dark and as deep as the night sky, seemed to look right into Alara's soul. "You have brought a great danger to our people, child of the outside world," the old woman said, her voice a dry, rustling whisper, like the leaves of the ancient cottonwood under which she sat. "I know," Alara replied, her own voice a hoarse, ragged sound. "And I am sorry. I did not know this place existed." "Few do," Orenda said. "That is why we still exist." She looked at Kale, a silent, questioning look in her old, wise eyes. "She is a survivor," Kale said, his voice a quiet, respectful statement. "She has a strong spirit, and she is hunted by the same evil that has been poisoning our downstream waters. Her fight is now our fight." The old woman was silent for a long time, her gaze seeming to weigh Alara's very soul. "We will give you shelter," she finally said. "We will tend to your wounds, and we will see what the spirits decide. But know this, Alara Vance. You are no longer just a captive who has found her freedom. You are now a part of the story of the Anishinaabe. And our stories are always written in the dust, and sometimes they are written in blood." The days that followed were a strange, feverish dream of healing and disorientation for Alara. The people of the hidden river were master healers, their knowledge of the desert's pharmacopoeia deep, ancient, and very practical science. Her wounds were treated with poultices of yucca and sage. Her exhaustion was soothed by a bitter, but restorative, tea brewed from the leaves of the creosote bush. She was given a small, clean wickiup of her own, a quiet, private space where she was left to the slow, patient work of her body's own mending. But it was a gilded cage of a different kind. She was a guest, but she was also a prisoner. She was treated with a gentle, cautious kindness, but she was also constantly watched. The people of the tribe were quiet, reserved folk, their faces polite but their eyes holding a deep, unreadable watchfulness. She was the outsider, the unknown variable, potential danger to their fragile, hidden peace. She was a scientist, and her instinct was to learn, to catalog, to understand. She tried to speak with the women of the tribe, to learn the names of the plants they used, to understand their methods of weaving and cooking. But she was met with a wall of polite, and very firm, silence. They would smile, they would nod, but they would not share their secrets. She was not one of them. The only person who would speak to her was Kale. He became her reluctant guardian, her only bridge to this strange, new world. He would bring her food, he would check on her wounds, and he would answer her questions, but his answers were always clipped, practical, and devoid of any real warmth. He was a man who was clearly conflicted, his duty to his people at war with the strange, grudging respect he seemed to have for her own, stubborn survival. They do not trust you, he said to her one evening as they sat by her small, private fire. I understand that, she replied, her voice a low, frustrated murmur. But I am not their enemy. Their enemy is Silas Kane. He is my enemy. We should be allies. An alliance with an outsider is a dangerous thing, Cale said, his dark eyes fixed on the fire. The last time our people made an alliance with the white man, it ended in a massacre. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the ghost of a profound, and very personal, tragedy. My wife, my daughter, they died of the white man's sickness, the one that came with the soldiers who promised us peace. The story was a blow, a stark, brutal reminder of the deep, and very bloody, chasm that lay between their two worlds. It was the old woman, Orenda, who finally offered her a path forward. She came to Alar's Wicayup on the 5th day, her movements as slow and as deliberate as the setting sun. You have the hands of a maker, the old woman said, her gaze on Alar's own scarred, but still elegant, hands. But you do not know the spirit of the things you make. You wish to be one of us. Then you must learn to be one of us. You must be tested. The test was not a grand, heroic trial. It was a series of small, humble, and deeply difficult tasks. She was sent to work in the fields, to weed the corn and the squash under the hot, merciless sun, her soft, scholar's hands quickly becoming a raw, blistered mess. She was sent to grind the corn, a back-breaking, repetitive labor that was a profound, and very humbling, lesson in the true cost of a single, simple meal. She was a failure. She was clumsy, slow, her body unaccustomed to the hard, physical labor that was the very foundation of the tribe's life. The women of the tribe watched her, their faces impassive, their silence a louder judgment than any spoken criticism. She was on the verge of despair, her pride in her own civilized skills now a bitter, useless ash in her mouth. She was an intellectual, a woman of the mind. And in this world, her mind seemed to be a useless, and very soft, liability. It was Cale who, in his own quiet way, saved her. He came to her one evening as she was struggling, and failing, to mend a tear in a piece of buckskin. He did not offer to do it for her. He simply sat beside her and, with his own scarred, but incredibly skilled hands, he showed her how to use the bone awl, how to work with the sinew. His movements a silent, patient lesson. Your world teaches you to think, he said, his voice a low, quiet rumble. Our world teaches us to do. You must learn to bridge the two. It was a turning point. She began to approach her tasks not as a scholar, but as a student. She began to use her greatest asset, her mind, not to impose her own preconceived notions of order on the world, but to observe, to learn, to understand. She began to see the science in their traditions, the logic in their rituals. She saw how the patterns they wove into their baskets were not just decorative, but were a kind of calendar, a map of the changing seasons. She saw how their stories, which she had at first dismissed as simple folklore, were in fact a complex, oral library of their history, their laws, their knowledge of the land. She began to earn a new, and very different, kind of respect. The women of the tribe began to speak to her, to answer her questions, to share their small, daily secrets. She was no longer just the outsider. She was a student, a strange, clumsy, but very determined one. Her final test came in a way that no one expected. A young boy, one of the children of the tribe, fell from a tree and suffered a deep, ugly, and very dirty gash on his leg. The tribe's own medicine woman treated it with her traditional, herbal remedies. But the wound festered. A dark, angry infection set in, and a high, dangerous fever began to consume the boy. The medicine woman was at a loss. She had used all her knowledge, and it was not enough. The boy was dying. Alar knew what it was. It was gangrene, a thing that, in her own world, was a death sentence without the proper, surgical intervention. She went to Orenda. I can save him, she said, her voice a quiet, confident statement of fact. But I must do it my way. I must use my own medicine. She had, in her desperate flight from the vulture's nest, managed to save a single, small, and very precious item from her medical kit, a small, sealed, tin case that contained a half-dozen sterilized surgical needles and a single sharp and very clean scalpel. The tribe was faced with a choice: to trust their own ancient traditions and watch the boy die, or to trust the strange, foreign magic of this outsider. It was Orenda who made the choice. Do what you must, the old woman said, her eyes holding a deep and very heavy trust. In the flickering, tense light of a ceremonial fire, Laura became a doctor again. With Kale as her assistant, she lanced the wound, cleaned it with a boiled, antiseptic solution of her own devising, and stitched it closed with a surgeon's precise, steady hand. She sat with the boy through the night, a silent, watchful vigil. And in the morning, the fever had broken. She had done it. She had saved him. She had used her own unique skills, the skills of her own very different world, to save a child of the tribe. She had been tested, and she had not been found wanting. She was no longer just a guest or a student. She was a healer, and she had, in a way that was more profound and more complete than any formal ritual, finally and irrevocably earned her place among the people of the Hidden River. The successful healing of the young boy was a turning point for Alara. It was a bridge built between her world of science and the tribe's world of tradition, and she was the architect. The wall of silence and suspicion that had surrounded her crumbled, replaced by a new, profound, and very genuine respect. She was no longer the strange, white-skinned outsider. She was Ashki-Dayan, the healer, a woman whose medicine was different, but whose power was undeniable. Her life in the valley of the Hidden River found a new, and surprisingly fulfilling, rhythm. She began to work alongside the tribe's medicine woman, a partnership of two very different sciences. She taught the old woman about the importance of boiling water to prevent infection, about the anatomy of a wound. And the medicine woman, in turn, taught her the secrets of the desert's pharmacopoeia, and knowledge that went far beyond Alara's own book-learned botany. Her bond with Kel deepened. It was not a relationship of romance, not in the way her own civilized world would have defined it. It was a partnership, a quiet, easy companionship forged in a shared, mutual respect for each other's skills and resilience. He would take her on long, silent journeys into the high country, teaching her the deeper, more subtle language of the land. He taught her how to track, how to move with a silence that was a kind of prayer, how to read the stories that were written in the dust and the stones. And she, in turn, shared with him her own world of knowledge, of history, of the stars, teaching him the names of the constellations from her father's books, turning the vast, empty night sky into a map of shared, and very ancient, human stories. She was happy. For the first time since her father's death, she felt a sense of peace, of belonging, of a purpose that was real, and tangible, and true. She was no longer a cartographer of the land, she was becoming a part of its very soul. But the shadow of her past was a long one, and it was creeping, slowly but inexorably, towards their hidden sanctuary. The first sign of trouble was a subtle, but deeply unsettling, change in the river. The clear, sweet water of their hidden stream began to take on a strange, metallic taste, and a thin, oily sheen would sometimes appear on its surface. The fish, which were a staple of their diet, began to die, their silvery bodies washing up on the banks. Kale and the tribe's other scouts rode out, following the river downstream, into the Badlands, to find the source of the poison. They returned 2 days later, their faces a mask of cold, grim fury. They had found it. A new crude, and very active mining operation about 20 miles downstream. A group of men were using arsenic and other powerful chemical agents to extract silver from a low-grade ore deposit, and they were dumping their toxic chemical sludge directly into the river system that was the lifeblood of the entire region. And the men who were running this mining operation were not common prospectors. They were the men of Silas Kane. Alara's heart went cold. She had thought, in her own naive way, that Kane would have given up the hunt for her, that she had simply disappeared into the vastness of the wilderness. But she had been wrong. He was not just hunting her. He was hunting the land itself. The story became clear. Kane, in his frustrated search for the legendary Hidden River Valley, had instead stumbled upon this deposit of silver. And now, with his usual, brutal pragmatism, he was exploiting it, with no thought for the consequences, for the poison he was pouring into the land, into the water, into the very future of the people who lived there. The shadow of the vulture's nest was lengthening, and its touch was a thing of death. The tribe held a council. The mood was grim. They were a people of peace, a people who had come to this valley to escape the violence of the world. But the world had found them. Some of the elders argued for a retreat. They could move, they said, go deeper into the mountains, find a new, hidden valley. They had done it before. But it was Orenda, the old, wise matriarch, who silenced them. We have run for a lifetime, she said, her voice a dry, rustling whisper, but with an underlying core of unbending steel. My father ran from the Spanish. I ran from the Mexicans. Cale ran from the blue-coated soldiers. We have run until there is no place left to run to. This is our home. This is the land of our ancestors, and of our children. We will not run again. Her words were a fire, a spark of the old, defiant, warrior spirit that had been dormant for a generation. The decision was made. They would fight. They were not a war party. They were a small, peaceful tribe of farmers and healers. But they were a people who were fighting for their home, for their very survival. And they had a new, and very unexpected, secret weapon. They had Alara. She was not a warrior. She could not fight with a bow or a knife. But she could fight a different kind of war. A war of the mind. A cartographer's war. And she knew her enemy. She knew the mind of Silas Kane. She knew his arrogance, his greed, his single-minded obsession with control. He is a man who thinks in lines, in maps, in territories, she said to Cale and the other leaders of the tribe, her voice a quiet, confident statement of fact. He will not expect us to fight his army. He will expect us to attack his operation, his source of wealth, his power. She went to her wickiup and returned with her father's beautiful brass sextant and a clean, fresh piece of vellum, the tools of her old life. To defeat a mapmaker, she said, a new hard and very dangerous light in her eyes, you must first make a better map. The shadow had fallen over their valley. But Alara Vance, the healer, the cartographer, the woman who had once been a captive, was about to teach Silas Kane a final, and very bloody, lesson in the true and tamable geography of the West. Alara's declaration was the beginning of a new, and very different, kind of war council. The elders of the tribe, men and women who were accustomed to making decisions based on ancient traditions and the signs of the natural world, now sat and listened to the quiet, logical, and surprisingly lethal strategies of the young, white-skinned woman they had taken in. She did not speak of war parties or of honorable, face-to-face battle. She spoke of logistics, of supply lines, of vulnerabilities. She was a surgeon, and she was laying out a plan for a precise, and very deadly, dissection of Silas Kane's entire operation. He is a king, she explained, using a stick to draw a crude map in the dirt floor of the council lodge. And a king has three things: his castle, his army, and his treasury. We cannot defeat his army in a direct fight. They are too numerous, too well armed. So, we will attack his castle, and we will attack his treasury. We will make his army useless. We will starve the wolf in his own den. Her plan was a two-pronged assault, a campaign of stealth and sabotage that was designed to hit Kane where he was strongest, and therefore, most vulnerable, his sense of absolute control. The first prong was a dangerous, deep reconnaissance mission. She needed to map not just the land, but Kane's entire operation. She needed to know the layout of his mining camp, the location of his powder magazine, the schedule of his supply wagons. It was a mission that would require a scout of unparalleled skill, and a cartographer of unwavering nerve. It was a mission for her and Cale. The tribe's elders were hesitant to send their best warrior, and their new, and very valuable, healer, deep into the heart of the enemy's territory was a terrible risk. But Orenda, with her deep, quiet wisdom, saw the necessity of it. She is right, the old woman said. The hawk and the woman who draws the land, they will be our eyes. Let them fly. The journey of Cale and Alara was a thing of silent, coordinated, and very deadly beauty. They moved through the Badlands not as two separate people, but as a single, perfectly functioning unit. He was the hunter, the master of stealth and silence, his senses alive to every nuance of the landscape. She was the analyst, the strategist, her mind a cold, clear instrument, absorbing every detail, her hand, steady and sure, translating what she saw into a language of lines and symbols on her vellum map. They found a hidden perch, a high, windswept rock formation that overlooked Kane's entire mining operation. For 2 days and 2 nights, They watched. They did not speak. They simply observed, a pair of patient, calculating predators. The mining camp was a raw, ugly scar on the land, a place of noise, and filth, and casual, brutal violence. But it was also a place of routine. And in that routine, Alara saw its weaknesses. She saw the single, heavily guarded wagon that brought the dynamite from a distant supply town. She saw the lazy, predictable pattern of the sentries who guarded the finished, refined silver that was stored in the camp's SE office. And she saw the arrogance, the carelessness, of men who believed they were invincible. She drew her map. It was not just a map of the terrain. It was a map of their enemy's soul. It was a blueprint for their destruction. The second prong of her plan was to be carried out by the tribe itself. While she and Kale were gone, the rest of the Anishazi were not to be idle. They were to become a ghost army, a force of psychological warfare. They began a campaign of subtle and deeply unsettling harassment. They did not attack Kane's men directly. They became whispers in the night. A patrol of Kane's men would return to camp to find their horses gone, their saddles and bridles neatly stacked, a silent, mocking testament to the fact that an enemy had been close enough to touch them, and they had never even known it. A sentry would be found at his post, not dead, but tied and gagged, a single, black-fletched arrow, Kel's signature, left beside him as a warning. They were not just fighting a war for their land. They were fighting a war for their own, half-forgotten identity. The peaceful farmers and healers were awakening the dormant, warrior spirit of their ancestors. And they were discovering that they were very, very good at it. When Alara and Kale returned, their precious map complete, they found a different tribe. The fear was gone, replaced by a new hard and very confident resolve. They were a people who had remembered who they were. The final war council was held. Alara laid out her map, its lines and symbols a clear, cold, and very logical plan for a final, decisive blow. The target was not the men. The target was the dynamite. The dynamite supply wagon was due in 3 days. It was their last chance. It was the linchpin of Kane's entire operation. Without it, his mining would cease. His profits would dry up. His army would desert him. The plan was a desperate and incredibly dangerous one. It would require perfect timing, a split-second coordination, and a great deal of courage. It was a cartographer's war, and it was about to reach its final, explosive, and very personal conclusion. The place Kale and Alara chose for their final, decisive stand was a narrow, winding canyon known to the people of the Hidden River as the Valley of the Stone Sentinels. It was a place of stark geological beauty and profound tactical advantage. The canyon walls were lined with massive, Buddha-like rock formations, tall, silent spires that looked like an army of ancient, petrified giants. The canyon floor was a treacherous, boulder-strewn passage, a perfect place for a trap. Alara's map had shown them that this was the only viable route for the heavy, cumbersome dynamite wagon to reach Kane's mining camp. And it was here that they would make their stand. They were not an army. They were a handful of warriors, a dozen of the tribe's best and bravest, led by Kale. But they had two advantages that outweighed their lack of numbers. They had an absolute, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and they had Alara's brilliant, cold, and very logical plan. The plan was a masterpiece of misdirection and controlled chaos. They would not try to stop the wagon. They would let it enter the valley. They would let it get to the very heart of their trap. For 2 days, they prepared. They did not build fortifications. They became a part of the fortifications that nature had already provided. They took up their positions among the stone sentinels, a dozen silent, painted ghosts, their bows drawn, their faces a mask of grim, patient resolve. Alara's position was the most critical and the most dangerous. She was not a warrior. She was the trigger. She was positioned on a high, narrow ledge that overlooked the canyon's narrowest point. Beside her was a massive, precariously balanced rock slide, a ton of loose scree and boulders that was held in place by a single key rock. She had her father's beautiful, brass sextant not as a tool of measurement, but as a signaling device. On the 3rd day, they came. The dynamite wagon, a heavy, slow-moving beast, rumbled into the mouth of the canyon. It was heavily guarded, with 4 outriders in the front, 4 in the back, and 2 men, including Kane's brutish second-in-command, Brutus, riding on the wagon itself. They were alert, their rifles held at the ready, their eyes scanning the high, silent canyon walls. But they saw nothing. They were riding into a graveyard, and they were the only ones who did not know it. The wagon rumbled deeper into the canyon. The high, stone sentinels seemed to watch them pass, their silent, stony faces a judgment. The front of the wagon reached the narrowest point, directly below Alar's position. This was it, the moment. She did not give a war cry. She did not fire a gun. She raised the sextant, its polished breast catching the afternoon sun, and she flashed a single, brilliant, and very precise beam of light to a high, hidden position on the opposite side of the canyon. It was the signal. From the high rocks, a single, black-fletched arrow flew not at a man, but at the lead mule of the wagon team. The arrow, fired by Cale with a master's deadly precision, took the animal in the neck. The mule screamed and went down, its fall causing a chaotic, tangled pile-up of the entire team. The wagon, its momentum suddenly, violently halted, slewed sideways, completely blocking the narrow passage. The trap was sprung. Before the outlaws could even begin to process what had happened, the air was filled with the silent, deadly whisper of a dozen arrows. The outriders, caught in the open, were cut down in a single, devastating, and utterly silent volley. Brutus, from the wagon, roared in a mixture of rage and surprise, his heavy shotgun booming, its blast of buckshot a loud, but useless, reply to a ghost army he could not see. It was then that Alara played her final, decisive card. She took the heavy, iron crowbar she had brought with her and, with all her strength, she jammed it into the crack beneath the single, keystone that was holding the rock slide in place. She pushed. The rock moved. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a low, groaning rumble that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth, the entire, unstable rock face gave way. A thunderous, deafening avalanche of rock and earth crashed down into the canyon, not on the wagon itself, but directly in front of it, and directly behind it, completely and irrevocably sealing the outlaws in a stone-walled tomb. The battle was over. It had not been a battle at all. It had been an execution. The surviving outlaws, Brutus and the other man on the wagon, were now trapped, their precious cargo of dynamite a useless, impotent symbol of their own explosive demise. They were surrounded, their escape cut off, their comrades dead. From the high rocks, the silent, painted figures of the Anishazi warriors rose, their bows held ready, their faces a mask of cold, hard, and very final judgment. The cartographer's war had been won. The silence that fell over the valley of the stone sentinels was profound and absolute. The dust from the rock slides settled, revealing a scene of complete, and very final, devastation. The dynamite wagon sat in its stone-walled tomb, a monument to a shattered ambition. The two surviving outlaws, Brutus and his companion, stood amidst the wreckage, their faces pale, their bravado gone, replaced by the raw, animal terror of men who knew they were about to die. But the Anishazi did not kill them. That was not their way. Cale and his warriors descended from the high rocks, a silent, implacable wave of justice. They disarmed the two men, their movements swift and efficient. They were now prisoners, their fate to be decided not by a quick arrow, but by the slow, deliberate judgment of the tribe's council. The true prize was not the prisoners, but the wagon itself. The dynamite, the very tool that Silas Kane had intended to use to rip the heart out of the mountains, was now in their hands. It was a weapon, and it was a symbol of their victory, of their reclamation of their own power. The journey back to the hidden valley was a triumphant, silent procession. They returned not just with their prisoners and their prize, but with a new, hard-won sense of their own strength. They were no longer a tribe of refugees, of survivors. They were a nation, a people who had successfully defended their home against a force that should have, by all the brutal logic of the frontier, destroyed them. And at the heart of this victory was the strange, white-skinned woman they had taken in. The healer, the cartographer, the quiet, unassuming scholar who had taught them how to fight a new kind of war. A great, ceremonial fire was lit in the center of the village that night. It was not just a celebration of their victory, it was a ceremony of adoption, of the formal welcoming of a new member into the heart of their tribe. Alara stood before the council of elders, before the entire, assembled population of the people of the Hidden River. Orinda, The old, wise matriarch stood and placed a hand on her shoulder. You came to us as a stranger, a fugitive from a world of chaos and greed, the old woman said, her voice a dry, rustling whisper that carried with a profound, sacred authority. You have bled with us. You have fought with us. You have shown us a new way, a new strength. You have the mind of a cartographer, but you have the heart of an Anshazi. She then gave her a new name. It was not a name of a warrior or of a healer. It was a name that encompassed the entirety of her journey, of the woman she had become. We will no longer call you Alara or Indased. We will call you Nakida, she who draws the land, for you have not just drawn our land on your maps. You have drawn its spirit into your own heart. You are one of us now. This is your home. A great, collective cry of approval went up from the tribe. Alara looked out at the faces in the firelight, at the people who were now her people. She looked at Kale, who stood beside her, his face a mask of quiet, profound pride. And she felt a sense of belonging, of a true and very deep peace that she had never known, not even in the ordered, civilized world of her father's library. The chains of her old life, the chains of her captivity, the chains of her own limited understanding of the world were well and truly broken. She was free. She did not know what the future held. She knew that Silas Kane was still out there, a wounded, but still very dangerous wolf. She knew that the outside world, with its relentless, inexorable hunger for land and for progress, would one day find its way to their hidden valley. But as she stood there, in the warm, firelit heart of her new home, surrounded by her new family, she was not afraid. They would face the future, whatever it brought, together. She was no longer a captive. She was no longer a victim. She was Nakidao, she who draws the land. She was a woman of two worlds, and she had, against all odds, forged a new one, a better one, for herself. The journey was not over, but for the first time, she was truly and completely home.